It's early June 2024 and it is time for the MOT on the Nippa, which I've owned for about 10 months. And so it's my first MOT with this car, and last year it failed only on one tyre, although there were a number of advisories, all of which we've addressed. And since then the car's done a couple of thousand miles, and a big chunk of those on a road trip out to the Netherlands you might have heard of. So I'm giving the car a shakedown. I haven't really used it in the last few weeks since coming back from the Netherlands, and whilst I'm doing this I'm going to tell you a little bit about the car. So first off, this is a 2000 model year Perodua Nippa EX, which means it's the basic one. You can get an EX or a GX. It was Britain's cheapest car for a few years, from the late 90s into the early noughties, before it was replaced by a more modern car called the Kalisa, both of which are Daihatsu based. In fact, they're basically rebadged Daihatsu Kuoras, Miras. I think they were sold under a number of other names. There's so much Daihatsu on this car, if it wasn't for the badge you'd assume that's exactly what it was. The branding is stamped absolutely everywhere. So under the bonnet we have a 3-cylinder petrol. I think it's got a mighty 42 brake horsepower, naturally aspirated. It's a single overhead cam design. Remarkably, it's actually multi-point electronic fuel injection, and it's quite a lot of fun to drive actually. 5-speed gearbox, but basically nothing else. And this specific version, the EX, had even less than the very basic GX. So I've got a lot of bare painted metal in the cabin here. I've got no power steering, no airbags, no ABS, no traction control. I've got no electric windows, no air conditioning, basically nothing. Don't even have a rear wiper on this. If you splashed out an extra few £100 for the GX model, you would get that rear wiper. You would get wheel trims. This one has bare steel wheels with a black plastic hubcap, and you get a few other niceties. The seats are a bit nice. The materials used on the door trims are a bit nicer, but otherwise not a great deal extra. Now I've recently returned from a trip to the Netherlands in this car, 524 miles, and the car acquitted itself remarkably well. What it wasn't was very comfortable. I've got seats here which are kind of deck chair like. There is a cloth material, very early noughties, late 90s style material in the centre, but the side trims are made of PVC, as are the headrests, and as I discovered, that poses a risk to exposed skin in hot weather. But it goes along really well actually, and funnily enough, for a car that's really a city car, it's probably happiest actually on the motorway at around 100 kilometers an hour, 60 miles an hour or so. It just lopes along without making a complaint. Around town, well, it's easy to drive. It is tiny. This is sort of the K-car class if you're in Japan, if you're familiar with that terminology. It's a really, really small car, and also need to remember that cars have generally got bigger over the course of the last few decades. So this one's remarkably small. When you park it next to even a modern small car, say a Mini or a Clio, something like that, it really shows just how tiny it is. And of course that means that you feel a bit vulnerable when you're driving, and you get a sense for just how dangerous driving can be. We've become anaesthetised to it. I drive modern cars, and when I get in this, I do think twice about overtaking, about cornering speeds, about braking distances, all those things that you're taught when you're learning to drive, but you're distanced from in the modern car. Steering on the car is unassisted, but it's light. At parking speeds, you do feel it, but it is not particularly difficult. I think anyone used to being spoiled by modern car power steering systems would probably complain, but genuinely it's not that difficult at all. The gearbox is, well, the gear shift quality isn't the best. It's likely to have degraded in the years since it was manufactured, but it does its job. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky trying to get into first or reverse, just one of the quirks of this car. Ride quality, it's a short wheelbase, it's got tiny little wheels, although the tyres on it are relatively high profile by modern standards. So it jiggles and bounces around a bit. Remarkably though, again, on the motorway it's fairly composed. I think probably because you're distracted by all the wind noise and other goings on and the imminent fear of death as you mix it with trucks on the modern highway. I'm giving this car a bit of a workout just to blow out all the gunk and gunge from the engine, although having done a recent long motorway trip, hopefully there's no carbon deposits or anything. Just want to make sure that the exhaust system's breathing cleanly and it's nice and up to temperature before it goes through the emissions test. Finding parts for these cars is really, really hard now, so few of them left. I think there's around about 30 of these cars supposedly left on the road, although I don't put a great deal of faith in some of the figures which are around. Currently another one of these up for sale, which is a GX spec, belongs to another collector. Hoping that'll end up in good hands. But finding bits and pieces for these, if something goes wrong, is really, really hard. So I've built up a little bit of a collection to help me out in the event of a problem in the future. Since I've had this car, I've done quite a lot to it. It was in really good shape. It's led a fairly sheltered existence throughout its 24 years on the planet, and it's only done just over 31,000 miles. I've done just over 2,000 miles in it since I bought it last summer. What have I done to this car? I have refurbished the wheels. I have had some hubcaps 3D printed to complete the look on this. It's been brushed down on the underside. There's absolutely no rot on the car, but it's been brushed down, cleaned underneath and treated to a nice coat of Waxol to preserve it for the future, because I do like to use the car year round. And we've done some work to the body to get rid of some of the scrapes and scuffs, tidy up the paintwork, just to ward off any risk of corrosion. It's been serviced, it's had a cam belt done. Funnily enough, it's gone into a sports car specialist that I use for other vehicles on my fleet, and I think it tickled them a little bit as it was mixing it in the workshop with some Exotica. One of the things I had to do to sort this car out was replace the exhaust system. It barely scraped through an MOT last year, and once I got it, it was held together with mesh and gunge and bits of metal, and it was pretty noisy. How it got through an MOT, I don't know, but I managed to find what I think is likely the last original specification manufacturer's exhaust in the country, by ringing round some of the former dealers. And whilst I was doing that, I actually found some other parts which will come in useful. Got a new set of bumpers, new old stock. I had thought I found some of the hubcaps. I was very pleased, but it turns out they don't fit all four wheels, so I ended up having to adapt those and getting them to the 3D printers, which was frustrating because it had to be done at fairly short notice and it wasn't cheap. Otherwise, the car's just had a clean up really. tidied up the paintwork, fitted a new stereo, just a cheap eBay jobby, and given it a bit of TLC just to make it more presentable. I haven't fitted the replacement bumpers yet. I gave the old ones a spruce up. There's a couple of scuffs here and there. It's never going to be concours. I just really enjoy driving it. I've developed a soft spot for this car. I've gone quite protective about it, and it lives in its own rented dry garage just to protect it from the elements. It's always lived inside. I believe the car actually stood for about 10 years, which is probably why it's still on the road today, because most of these have been scrapped. As you can imagine, a car that was super cheap when it was new quickly became more or less financially worthless. And whilst these are pretty tough, they're Japanese mechanicals going on for years and years, they were prone to corrosion, just as the Daihatsu branded versions were. So after a while, it was no longer worthwhile welding and repairing, and this car just got chucked away. A couple of scrappage schemes since. They're a rare sight, and I think genuinely, apart from recent shows where a couple of these showed up, I've only ever seen 2 of these on the road. Seen a few more Kalisas, loads of the more modern Mivi, which is the Daihatsu Sirion, and a very competent car. But they only sold a couple of thousand of these, and the survival rate is astonishingly low. Nobody knows what it is when you tell them. And the funny thing about owning a Nippa, if you go to a show, it gets a huge amount of attention, often upstaging much more exotic machinery that's parked next to it. In fact, the first show I took it to at Brooklands, there were people all over this car, and it inspired me to do a bit more to it, to get it up to scratch, to do some work, spend a few pounds on the restoration and getting it more presentable and sharing it with others. And wherever it goes, it always fascinates. So much so that I've actually put together an information board for shows to answer the questions that people always pose. Most of those questions are something along the lines of, what is it? Right, giving it some of the beans. No idea how many revs we've just achieved, because I don't have a rev counter. It does have a clock though, and the readout is very clear. No mistaking the time, particularly if you are the front passenger, because the clock is right in front of you, built into the dashboard. A nice green LED display. Coming into the services here. I was here yesterday charging my electric car, doing my bit to offset the very tiny carbon emissions from the pea shooter exhaust pipe. I'm going to pull in a moment and get myself some breakfast whilst we check the car over, check the lights, check everything's working prior to the MOT. Walking back from the services just now, I realised there's another key piece of kit which is missing from this car, and that is a lights on warning buzzer. Had the lights on earlier to check that they're working okay for the MOT, which I'm now on my way to get started, and I left the lights on. Would have been a disaster if it had been overnight, but anyway, we're on our way. All systems seem to be running, and just a few minutes away from the MOT testing station. The engine a few revs just to blast out the cobwebs as we make our way over. It's 8:30 in the morning. It's a very sunny day, start of June, and having got in the car, it was not very warm. I am now very warm. No air conditioning, and no tinted glass, which means this car is something of a greenhouse. In fact, the previous owner told me that she had to be careful about what she would wear when when she was driving the car to avoid roasting and burning her skin. So I've got a summer of fun to look forward to. I've got a few things lined up for this car. Next month it is Festival of the Unexceptional. I'm taking the car up to Lincolnshire for the weekend. That's actually why I bought this car. One of the reasons I bought this car when it came up for sale. It was a bit of an impulse purchase, but I had fairly recently come back from the Festival of the Unexceptional, thinking I really need something that I can bring along. Travelled in a friend's car last year, and although I've got a couple of older cars, neither of them are what you'd call unexceptional. At the moment I've got a nice MG ZS 2003 and a decent MGF from 1999, and they don't really fit the bill, although they're sort of from fairly humdrum origins. They're just not funny enough. So when this came up, I thought, right, I'm going to have that, and off I went to go and pick it up. I actually found myself fighting, I think, with a few other potential suitors for this car when I went to look at it. It seemed to be popular amongst those who are informed on their existence. So here we are, just approaching the MOT centre. There is a Daewoo Lanos there with a slightly amusing number plate, which I'll come on to. This is the second time in 2 weeks I've been to this place, and there's the MOT tester, so I'm going to go now. So there we are then, one MOT in the bag, so another year of fun and games ahead for the Nippa. That's the third MOT I've done on my fleet this year, second one in 2 weeks. And unless I buy another car, that's it now until next year. So what have we got planned for the Nippa? Well, I wanted to get today out of the way first, just to make sure all was okay. It wasn't really in doubt. But I think really just let's get it serviced. That's due later on in the summer. Oil and filter change. Might do some of the ignition parts as well. Don't know when they were done last, although it seems to be running fine. And otherwise just keep tinkering with it and looking at some of the cosmetics. I might detail under the engine bay, deal with the little bit of corrosion that's around the boot, but otherwise just keep enjoying the car. So I'm really pleased it's got its MOT. The tester, first of all asking what the F is it, realised it was a Daihatsu, and it seems to have been the talking point of the workshop today. In fact, the guy who was waiting for his MOT was asking me about it. And this is life with the Nippa. One element of life with the Nippa is crashing over bumps like that, but wherever you take this car, it gets people interested and they come up to you, and it gets far more interest than many sort of more conventional classics that I've driven or been in. Wherever you go, people always asking you, what is it? And I love it. For a pretty small investment, this car turns heads. This car gets people talking, and that's exactly what the classic car hobby is all about.